In 2019, a story coming out of a small community in Vermont broke and made national headlines. A 92-year-old man named Ronald Reed had died at the age of 92. And there you see it made CNBC on TV. Well, what was the headline? He didn't die under suspicious circumstances. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't famous. That wasn't the headline. In fact, actually, Reed was the opposite of wealthy and famous. He was a janitor and a cashier his whole adult life, lived in the same small house his whole adult life, drove a beat-up Toyota Yaris practically his whole adult life, is held together by duct tape. He wore flannel shirts and jeans that he bought from thrift stores. When he shopped for groceries, he was known to use coupons a lot and get generic brands of things. And people wondered if, thought he was just barely getting by. But Reed had a secret. For years, he was taking small amounts from his paychecks and investing them. He would go to the library and read financial newspapers, study companies, and buy certain stocks. But he never touched any of that money. And so when people would ask him, why didn't he spend more money on himself? Why didn't he buy a nicer car or take vacations or something? And he would just say, I'm saving it for something that matters. Well, when Reed died and his will was read, people figured out what was really going on. He had built up a fund of $8 million, and he gave the whole thing to charity. $8 million. His whole life, he had just built up, he had devoted himself to building up this savings, becoming a millionaire in the process, but for one purpose, to give it all away. Reed understood something that I believe Mary understood. And we're going to talk about this as we look at the story of Mary doing this for Jesus. They understood that the things that we treasure most aren't always the things that we can spend money on. The satisfaction comes from investing in things that are meaningful and that last beyond us. So we're talking about Mary, the sister of Martha. Yes, that Mary and Martha, sister of Lazarus. And her act of devotion teaches us what it means to worship and give with extravagant, generous love. Now, before we get into the story, we need to clear up something that I think a lot of people can get confused about. The story we're looking at in John chapter 12 is also recorded in Matthew 26 and Mark 14. So 3 of the gospel writers talk about this story, but it gets confused with a different story about a different woman who also pours out perfume on Jesus' feet, and that story is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke chapter 7. So both of these stories are about women anointing Jesus, but they're different events, they're different women, and they teach us different things. So in Luke 7, that happens at the house of a Pharisee named Simon. And it happens early in Jesus' ministry. And at that time, or what happened there was a quote-unquote sinful woman came and anointed his feet with perfume. It wasn't necessarily expensive perfume, but she anointed his feet and she was crying heavily and crying in remorse and shame. And Jesus forgave her and confirmed her saving faith. Now, in that story, if you remember that, the Pharisee named Simon was offended by all this. And in the story in John, it's one of the disciples that's offended. In the Luke story, Simon was offended because Jesus would converse with, let alone let this person touch him, who was a sinful person. And, if you recall that story, Jesus has some things to say about that and had some things to teach about that. Well, here, again, it's in Bethany, different town. It's at Lazarus' house, not Simon's house. It's a couple of days before the Passover. near the end of Jesus' life. And Mary, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, anoints Jesus' feet not out of guilt and shame, but instead out of devotion, as an act of worship and gratitude. So the event recorded in Luke has things to teach about forgiveness and grace and saving faith. But this event recorded in John has some other things to teach us. So one of the things we can pull out of this is just in the story arc of Jesus' life, this event prepares Jesus for the cross. He even mentions this, that this is done to prepare for my burial. So that's one thing. We're not going to focus on that so much. The second thing is what we're going to focus on more, and that is this event, this experience, this encounter shows us what profound and extravagant worship and gratitude looks like. So Mary's act teaches us some lessons. And today we're going to focus on it this way, what the story reveals about extravagant love. Okay, we're going to talk about four things. So the first one is that extravagant love, this story reminds us or teaches that extravagant love is kind of by definition, it's something that we give our best. Extravagant love gives its best. So look again, let's remind ourselves what is actually happening here, what goes on. Mary, what she's doing here, she took, it says, about a pint of pure nard. This would have had to have been imported from India, would have been very expensive. In fact, John goes on to tell us that it costs about a year's wages. So I suppose in today's dollars, depending on what someone's wages were, 40,000, 50,000, whatever. Maybe, we don't know if she was wealthy or if this was her life savings. It was a huge amount of money, hugely valuable. And Mary pours it all out on Jesus' feet. She didn't just measure out a few drops, from this nice perfume and then put the rest away. She broke the jar, poured it all out, no holding back. And then she wiped the oil into Jesus' feet with her hair, which I suppose to us might seem a little strange, but at her time, in her culture, it would have been shocking. Because a respectable woman would always keep her hair covered. And she would never let her hair be uncovered or do anything like this with it. So obviously Mary didn't care what other people thought. She humbled herself. She knelt. She was vulnerable. This is what extravagant love looks like. Now, as you can imagine, the Bible has a lot to say about generous giving. 2 Corinthians, the Apostle Paul writes about a group of churches in Macedonia. And he says that these people from these churches, they gave as much as they were able and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the Lord's people. So they begged for the privilege of giving. They gave beyond their ability, and they loved doing it. That's extravagant love. In Romans 12, Paul says, "Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, not just your money, but yourselves, your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship." King David understood this principle of generosity as well. There was a time he was going to offer this sacrifice, and this guy named Araunah wanted to give David some things that he could use for this sacrifice, and David refused. And he said, "No, I insist on paying for this. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing." He refused to give leftovers. He insisted on giving something that was valuable, that cost him. Mary understood this too, and her act challenges us today. So let's be honest, this kind of generosity does not come naturally to us. I mean, our instinct is to hold back, to save, excuse me, to protect. We think if I give too much, then I'm not going to have enough. Mary's story reminds us that extravagant love overcomes that instinct. It overcomes our fears, our maybe innate selfishness. I mean, what is it that makes someone do that? What is it that would make someone pour out something like super valuable instead of clinging to it? I think it's love. If you really love someone, you don't count the cost, right? You don't think in terms of what's the least thing I can get by with. You want to give. You want to show, to demonstrate this love that you have. I mean, think about the people that you love the most. Maybe parents or children or grandchildren or a spouse or some close friend. When you love a person like that or people like that, you want to give to them. You find joy in giving to them. So you sacrifice sleep, money, energy, comfort, because your heart is full and you want to give. And that's what Mary does here. She experienced Jesus' power, right? She'd been blessed by all the things that Jesus had done for them, for the teaching, for her life change, and then also for healing, resurrecting her brother. And so this love was so deep, this gratitude was so deep, she couldn't hold it back. She just gave her best. So then that raises the question for us, okay, does our love for Christ move us to give with a kind of deep generosity? And the issue is not just money. I mean, it's not just about possessions, but giving our time, our energy, our service, our devotion. So, again, I don't know where this lands for you. Is there maybe a call in your life to look again at what does devotion to God, what does my giving to God, is there a call to step that up in some way? All right, so let's move on. The second thing this story teaches us is that extravagant love is not always understood by other people. So following Christ and doing things for Christ, sometimes other people are going to like it, and sometimes other people will criticize it. And so we have to learn to discern between legitimate concerns and religious pettiness, or maybe even jealousy. So when Mary broke this jar open, poured out the perfume, somebody had an opinion about it, didn't they? And he spoke up. Judas had a problem. Verse 5, he says, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It's worth a year's wages." Now, on the surface, this sounds reasonable. It sounds maybe even noble. Who could argue with helping the poor? But John goes a little deeper and tells us the truth behind Judas's motives. He didn't say this because he cared about the poor. He was a thief. He was a keeper of the money bag, and he used that. He would help himself to the money that was in there. But I also want to say it's possible that it wasn't just Judas raising a concern. If you look at the parallel account of this, which is in Matthew 26, there it says that the disciples, plural, the disciples were indignant about this thing that Mary did, and they talked about how it was a waste. So the disciples in that account, plural. So maybe it wasn't just Judas. Maybe it wasn't just a bad guy and a thief, which makes sense because don't you see it sometimes that sometimes it's even well-meaning followers of Christ who can miss the point, misunderstand things. So, and again, notice in this that Judas and whoever else, they made Mary's act of worship seem selfish and wasteful. They made it sound like she didn't care about poor people, like her devotion was somehow harmful to others. And this is how religious criticism so often works. It takes something that's beautiful and pure and makes it sound wrong, questions your motives, makes it seem like you're irresponsible or extreme, makes you feel bad for doing something that there's no reason to feel bad about. The Apostle Paul experienced criticism like this throughout his life. People misunderstood what he was doing and why he was doing it. They questioned his methods. They questioned his motives. In a few places, he has to write to defend himself. In Galatians 1, he says, "Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Am I trying to please people? If I were trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ." He knew that sometimes serving Christ was going to mean being misunderstood, losing approval, being criticized. And this is something that we don't like to talk about, but we do have to expect as Christians, that when we make sacrifices for our faith, not everybody is going to pat us on the back. Some people will criticize. Some people will find some problem with it. And, this happens in all kinds of ways. So just one modern example of this would be Mother Teresa. And she, probably you're all familiar with her, she devoted her life to serving the poorest of the poor in Calcutta. And she was criticized a lot. Some accused her of not doing enough. Some accused her of posing for media, getting lots of media for herself, but not really doing anything about the systemic issues. Some questioned her methods. Some even questioned her motives. And yet, while the critics debated, sitting in their offices writing articles or giving talks at conferences in fancy places, she was there in the slums of Calcutta, washing wounds, feeding the hungry, caring for the dying. Her critics had opinions. She had love. Here's what we need to understand about religious criticism. Sometimes it comes from people who are more concerned about appearing spiritual than actually being spiritual. Sometimes it comes from people who are threatened by our devotion because it shines a light on them. Sometimes it comes from people like Judas who have hidden motives. Not always. Sometimes, to be fair, criticism might be legitimate. Sometimes we do need correction and guidance. But this is especially true today, where everybody seems to have an opinion about everything, whether they understand it or not, and they don't mind sharing it. And so we've got to learn to tune out the noise and keep focusing on running the race, doing the work that God has called us to do. People are not always going to understand. But the good news is that Christ does. He sees your devotion, he knows your heart, and he loves it. So the question is, will we let criticism or even the fear of criticism from other people hold us back? Mary models the way here as in so many other ways. She doesn't argue. She doesn't explain herself as far as we see in this text. She doesn't respond. She doesn't try to justify her gift. She just gave it, and Jesus defended her. So extravagant love isn't always understood, but it's always worth it. Okay, the third thing we learn in this passage is that extravagant love accomplishes purpose we don't always see or understand. If you look at verse 7, Jesus speaks up and he says, "Leave her alone. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial." All right, so when Mary poured out this perfume on Jesus, do you think she was thinking about him dying and that she was doing this for his burial? I highly doubt it. I don't think she was thinking about that. She wasn't thinking about the cross. She was simply expressing her love and gratitude to Jesus because he had recently healed her brother. He had changed their lives as a family. She was doing this, her motive was gratitude and an expression of love and devotion. What's important to remember about this is that when we give, when we serve, when we act in love, God can take what we do, what we give, and use it in ways far beyond what we imagine. Think of it like planting a seed. When you give, you're planting a seed. And when we plant something, we don't always see what's going on under the ground. We don't always know how it's going to grow, when it will grow. Sometimes we might put a seed and we don't even know what it is, what's going to happen. But the results come over time. God brings the results over time. In Isaiah 55, God says, as the rain and snow come down from heaven and do not return to it without watering the earth and making it bud and flourish, so that it yields seed for the sower and bread for the eater, so is my word that goes out from my mouth. It will not return to me empty. It will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it. Now that's speaking of when God's word goes out, but when actions and when service for God goes out, God uses that and multiplies it in ways that we don't always see or understand. God's purposes always bear fruit, even when we don't see it, even when we don't, the timing isn't what we expect. James 4 reminds us, you do not even know what's going to happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. This life is short. Our opportunities are limited. We can't always wait for someday. Extravagant love focuses on, seizes the moment. That's what Mary did. She didn't know that she was preparing Jesus for burial. She just loved him and gave her best, and God used her act in a bigger way than she could have ever have imagined. And the same thing is true for us. Whatever it is we do, simple act of service, a prayer, a gift, a word of encouragement, we may think it's small, we may not see a result, but God uses it often in ways that we can't see. Okay, finally the fourth, extravagant love creates ripple effects. The things we do out of devotion to Christ have an effect. Maybe these things motivate and encourage other people. Maybe other people get confused. Or maybe it causes them to become even more spiritually resistant. They might misunderstand what we're doing. That understanding might be mixed with them just reacting against who God is and what God's doing. Not everybody gets it. We've been talking already about Judas and his response, but it goes on from there. Look what happens after Mary does this. We're told towards the end here, verses 9, 10, and 11, that a large crowd gathered, and they found out that Jesus was there, but they didn't just come to see Jesus, they also came to see Lazarus. So once again, we're talking about ripple effects. Lazarus was sort of becoming a mini celebrity. He didn't even have to say anything, just by being there, because of what God had done for him, his life was a testimony. And but also notice what else happens, which is kind of this repeated pattern, which I'm not going to go into, but I'll just bring it up, is that this thing that happens, the enemies of Jesus see it, and then it causes them to step up their plans to resist him. So they not only make plans now to kill Jesus, but they're also going to they're making plans to kill Lazarus, because Lazarus, on account of him, many of the Jews were coming over to Jesus. So this is how it works when we love Jesus extravagantly, is that this devotion creates ripple effects. It draws seekers. It also draws opposition, resistors. But it never leaves people unchanged. So Mary's act of worship that night, I mean, she might have thought, this is something I'm going to do, and I hope it will be a blessing to Jesus. Well, everybody was shocked by it. And they talked about it. They kept talking about it. The early church kept talking about it. And 3 of the 4 gospel writers remember it. And 2,000 years later, we're still talking about this and learning from this today. It touches way beyond we can expect. Well, there's another ripple effect that comes out here. You just have to bear with me. This is not specifically mentioned in the passage, but I'm inferring it because of the teaching in other passages, and I think it's important for us to keep this in front of us. And I'll put it in terms of a question. Who do you think was the happiest person at that dinner party that night? Now, we know who the most unhappy person was, right? It was Judas, because this money was wasted that he could have taken from. But who was the most happy person there? Now, you might say it was Lazarus, because, he had been very sick and he had died, and now he was come back to life, so he's alive. That's a pretty good day. That's a pretty good night. Or maybe you might say it was Jesus. He loved this family. He was able to be with his friends, and Mary's expression of love and devotion to him had to have been very heartwarming and meaningful to him. So maybe Jesus was the happiest person there, even in the midst of the stress he was under, knowing the opposition was growing and knowing that he would soon be going to the cross. But on this night, maybe he was just really happy. Well, I want to propose something to you. See what you think of this. I think the happiest person at that dinner party was Mary. That Mary was the most joyful person in the room. And I'm saying that because we know that giving, yes, it blesses the receiver, but it also blesses the giver. And you know this if you've ever given something really meaningful to someone you love. You know what I'm talking about, that something is given, that person is blessed, but you are blessed. You are freed. It's hard to describe. The giver is blessed more than we can imagine. Not as long as we're giving without strings, right? If you're giving with the expectation that the person is going to respond in a certain way, or you're going to get something, maybe you'll get it, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll always be disappointed because the person isn't as grateful as you think they should be. So if you leave all that aside and just give for the sake of giving, there's a joy. There's something that happens in your heart. And I know this sounds super counterintuitive. It goes against everything our culture, our stressed out, depressed, materialistic culture is doing everything it can to convince us that happiness is something that we can only get if and when we get more stuff. We think that the ticket to more joy is having more possessions, more experiences, more money, more comfort, more security. So we work really hard and get a better job, and we make more money, so we get that more. And then we realize it's not working. We're still struggling. We're still unhappy. There's still things we don't have, still things that aren't right. So we think, okay, well, maybe the problem is I need even more. And we keep on going, like a carrot dangling out in front of us that's always out there. We think that happiness is something that we will get on the other side of more. If you think that, and I want to especially speak to whatever young folks are here, you really need to take a look at the lives of people who have a lot, who have more than they know what to do with. Are they happy? Are they satisfied? Look at what happens when people finally have more than they know what to do with. What do people do then? Well, we know the answer to that question because we're seeing it on the news and in stories all over the place. It's usually not good. When stressed out, anxious, or depressed, poor people get rich, they become depressed, anxious, stressed out, unhappy rich people. In fact, there may be more stressed out and anxious now because they got more stuff to worry about. There's all kinds of things to worry about with the business, and people want stuff from them, and they got to manage all this stuff, work to not lose it. Or maybe they're more depressed because they finally see that this thing that they've been working for doesn't make them happy. Years ago, I heard this saying, and you've maybe heard it before as well, but I want to share it because it just bears repeating. I don't know who said it, but they said that the poor are better off than the rich because the poor still think that money can buy happiness, but the rich know better. What's left for you after you've got all this stuff that you're chasing after? And then you realize it hasn't made you any happier or more fulfilled. Drugs, alcohol, suicide, just whatever you can to shut down because it's just not working. What if we have it all backwards? What if our society is exactly, positively, 100% wrong? What if the happiest people in the room are not the ones who have the most stuff, but the ones who are the most content with whatever they have and are using that to give to other people? What if the happiest person isn't the one who's gotten the most, but the one who's giving the most? What if joy comes from the giving and not the getting? And by the way, this is where there's an exception to this, all rich people are unhappy, because that's not the case, right? There are rich people who figure this out, who see that the stuff they have is not what's going to make them happy. So they still are earning the money, but they're focusing on serving other people with it, giving. And, some of you, that's true of some of you here at this church, and your life is a testimony because of that. Scripture shows this connection, this pattern again and again, that giving actually brings fulfillment. Exodus 36 talks about the Israelites when they're giving to build the tabernacle. And so they put out a call for people to donate stuff for the tabernacle, and people give so much, so extravagantly, that Moses literally doesn't know what to do with it all. And he tells people to stop giving their stuff. And it says, so they got way more than they needed, and the people were filled with joy. Another time, King David and the Israelites gave for the temple, 2 Chronicles 29. And then the text says this: then the people rejoiced because they'd given willingly with the whole heart, they had offered freely to the Lord, and David the king rejoiced greatly. The people rejoiced. David rejoiced. What was the consequence of their giving, what followed generosity? Joy. 2 Corinthians 9, Paul writes this: the point is this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. You're sowing, you're planting seeds. Whoever sows bountifully will reap bountifully. Each one must give as he's decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. Jesus himself said it's better to give than to receive. So when people give freely, give extravagantly, they don't walk away empty, they walk away full. People rejoiced when they gave to build the temple. David rejoiced when he gave. The people in the Macedonian churches rejoiced when they gave. That's a principle. Now, so there's a very specific, to round this up, to close this off, I have a very specific takeaway I want to offer to you this morning. And no, I am not asking anyone to break the bank, sell off possessions. We're not getting ready for a capital campaign or anything at Bethel. This is not what this is about. It's not about what the church needs. It's what each of us need in our own individual lives. So here's the challenge, and let's just start here. I encourage you this week to find something specific to give It may be money for something. It may be service, time, but something that where you genuinely experience that you're giving something significant. Don't force yourself to do something that you're not comfortable with, but what you feel called to do, take that step, and then pay attention to what happens in you, in your heart, in your inner life when you do that. Just notice how you feel, what goes on inside of you when you do something generous. What happens when you give of yourself, when you give of your service, when you worship extravagantly? I am willing to bet that you will discover what Mary discovered that night, what Ronald Reed discovered throughout his life. You'll discover what every generous person throughout history has discovered, and that is, this is what we were created for. This is how we're wired up. This is what it means to be a human being created in the image of God. God is a generous God. And so when we give, there's this part of us that comes alive, the true self, the divine nature in us, our higher self. So I'm serious about this. Try it this week. And I said I'm willing to bet on this. So here's the deal. If you have a bad experience, if you give something and then you regret it and you feel bad, so contact me. All right. Now I can't promise I'm going to refund all your money. I can't do that. But we'll go out to lunch. I'll take you out to lunch or coffee, and we'll talk about it, and we'll make a plan for getting things back on track for you. All right? So, and I'm saying this because I am convinced that the giver receives as much, if not more, than the receiver when we give. That extravagant love creates ripple effects of joy that starts in your heart and then builds from there. So I'll close with the question, what will you give to Jesus today? What's your jar of perfume?